You're listening to ARC. It's the early 1970s in Uppington in northern South Africa, and St. Augustine's library is probably busy. TV hasn't arrived in the country yet. It's deep apartheid and there isn't much to do. Not for the young Samuel Dawids anyway, who works at the library.
I have started to read at a very young age, and I was an assistant librarian at school, so I spent more time with books than with people.
As he walks up and down the aisles, sorts and puts books back on the shelves, Samuel tries to make sense of the world he's growing up in. Even for a bookish kid in a dusty provincial town, it's clear that there's something wrong. The world isn't really the way it's supposed to be.
And my mind is the kind of a questioning mind. I'm too curious, so nothing is too sacred to look at or to learn or to inquire. You understand? So I could quickly sense that something is wrong.
One of the things that's wrong is apartheid education. Because even though the young Samuel loves learning, he won't go on to finish high school. He's a person of color, and the system doesn't want too many people of color with too much education. But still, Samuel learns. From reading, but also from thinking about the inner workings of the library itself. The books don't just go on the shelves at random. There's a system in place. It's called the Dewey system.
The Dewey system of sorting the books in the library, classification and all of that, I learned it there.
What Samuel begins to realize is that what truly governs the library isn't the hands that place the books on the shelves or the head librarian. It's the system. Just like outside the building, where the police might be the ones upholding the law. But what truly matters is the classification system that places people in a hierarchy according to race, with the now notorious name of apartheid. But where does it come from?
That's also how I learned about Carolus Linnaeus.
Carolus Linnaeus, or Carl if you don't speak Latin. A Swedish botanist from a long time ago that Samuel Dawids came to believe had something to do with the world outside the library, where he was stacking books in the 1970s. And, as it turns out, also with the Austrian anthropologist Rudolf Pöch, whose trip to the Kalahari and all the bones he took from there this season of the Unburied Podcast is about. How all of that is connected is the subject of episode 3 of this season. We call it the Swedish Curse. My name is Rasmus Bitsch. I met Samuel Dawids briefly last year, and I've wanted to speak to him for a while. It's proven difficult because he lives in Rimfasmark on the banks of the Orange River, and I live 1,000 kilometers away on the southern tip of South Africa. But the bigger issue is that Samuel never seems to be home. Okay, hello, how are you?
No, I'm doing fine. Yourself?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Tell me, where are you right now?
Oh, right now I am here with one of my committee members here in Pofadder.
Samuel Dawids is hard to pin down. And I don't mean only his whereabouts. He's in his early 60s, a scholar, as he says, but not really.
Yeah, I'm more of a scholar, you understand? Yeah, I'm more a man of the mind than a man of the heart. I'm using the word scholar more in a sarcastic way because I don't even have metric.
And when I ask him on the phone what title I should use to introduce him in this podcast, the trend continues.
You should choose. I couldn't care what people call me.
And yet, Mr. Dawids isn't just anybody.
I'm the crown prince. So a crown prince, I'm the next person to become king of the Nama people in South Africa.
But it isn't out of humility that Samuel Dawids does not introduce himself as a prince. It's because that isn't how it's done.
If I've got to say who I am, I just call my names. We are introduced. You understand? So if there's nobody to introduce me, I don't use a royal title. That's how we've been taught.
All right. So somebody would need to introduce you for you to use your title.
Yes.
All right.
So in the social order, the elders, they are the highest authority. And in the political order, we the royals are the highest authority. If I am now at home, if one of my uncles come and they send me to the shop, I go to the shop and I go and buy that thing and come and give him. He's my uncle. If he send me to the shop and say, go and buy bread, I'm going to buy that bread and I'm going to bring. If he say, make me tea, I'm going to make him tea. My title means nothing there.
There's a reason Samuel Dawids cares about protocol. Because protocol is custom and custom is part of culture. And culture is very important to him. Because his culture was almost destroyed.
The Nama and the Bushmen were the only people who faced genocide. We have got deep generational trauma. The cruelty, the brutality, everything that went with it. You see what cultural imperialism did. Almost obliterating the languages, cultural systems. You see,
custom, culture, order, hierarchy, and systems are all different words we use to describe how we as humans organize the world. And systems like Samuel Dawids understood in the library as a child are powerful. But they aren't natural. They come from somewhere.
You mentioned to me Carolus Linneaus. In your words, what does he have to do with the human remains at the end of the day?
Now I mentioned Carolus Linnaeus because in his classification of the animal kingdom, the current Homo sapiens to whom we are said to belong are coming from more archaic forms like hominids and so on. So that theory was used in order to kind of classify we as Africans as animals.
In midsummer in northern Sweden, the sun never sets. It simply circles around in the sky. So it must be liked in the summer of 1732, when a young scientist arrives in the land of the Sami people to study them and their natural environment. The young man is on horseback, and his name is Carl Linnaeus. And the trip will kickstart a scientific career that will change not only his life, but the entire history of science. And if this sounds like something you've heard before on this podcast, it's of course because there are obvious parallels to Rudolf Pöch and his Kalahari expedition 175 years later. But Linnaeus isn't particularly interested in bones, animals, or even humans.
Mr. Linnaeus was actually more interested in plants.
This is Alan Morris, Professor Emeritus from the University of Cape Town and the author of many books, the most recent Bones and Bodies, about how South African scientists studied race.
Happily retired at this stage, but still researching and still doing things. Forensic anthropology, human evolution, human anatomy.
Like Nama Prince Samuel Dawids, Alan Morris also begins his story with Linnaeus.
He was doing a medical degree at Uppsala, and as was always the requirement of a medical degree, you had to do a thesis.
Both Pöch and Linnaeus went on a research trip to the lands of an indigenous people to take the next step in their respective careers. But Linnaeus' research project was a lot more ambitious than Pöch's.
And he chose to do his thesis as the catalogue of all living things.
Basically, Alan Morris says, in the 1700s, scientists in Europe expanded their vision for describing the natural world. This was the emergence of modern natural science. But the scientists of the day had a problem. The way different species were named and categorized didn't work at all.
Let's say it's a plant, so they would describe it, giving it a Latin name, which would be tall plant with yellow flowers, blooming in the spring with an overwhelming smell. So the definition of that species would be 5 different Latin names, all describing characters, and it was a mess.
This messy system was completely unsuited for Linneaus' ambitious project.
So Linnaeus cleaned up the mess, and he created what's called the binomial system, genus and species. In the case of us, he was the one who coined Homo sapiens.
So with this new idea of a system, Linnaeus set out to describe, well, every living thing.
So his job was not difficult as far as he was concerned. He just had to figure out what God had created and give it a name. And he did that. The first volume in 1735 was 13 pages long. The 10th edition in 1758 was 350 pages. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Linnaeus had a big but pretty straightforward job ahead of him.
Linnaeus believed that God had created all of these species as independent species on day one of creation.
Except upon closer inspection, the job wasn't really so simple after all. Because as Linnaeus saw, the pure, independent species God had created tended to mix and evolve. Where one species ended and another began wasn't always so clear.
Each species had been created as a type, and at one point in time, when it was created, it was pure and it was different from every other species. It was patently obvious to him that that was no longer true. And he felt this was the result of impurity. So his species, his concept of species, which was eventually taken up by varieties of humans, was the idea that it was his job to identify that kernel of purity that identified the species so that he could ignore all the variation.
This is the point that would later manifest itself through the young Pöch in the Kalahari. The idea that creation was made up of pure types. And variation was essentially contamination, which had to be ignored if one wanted to study God's creation at its most fundamental level.
His ideas were the canon of scientific thought. And that carried through right from, he died in 1775 or something, it carried right through the 19th century into the early 20th century, right into the 1920s, 1930s, we were talking about Linnaean species. And one of the wonderful things about Linnaean system is it's so easy to use.
Linnaeus' system was so useful that it survived the emergence of a whole new way of thinking, Darwin's new concept of evolution.
Initially, from Darwin's period, there was this view that evolution made species get better and better and better.
The combination of early Darwinism and Linnaean classification manifested in a new way of thinking about human evolution. If humans got better and better, culminating in the modern European, there would have been earlier versions of humans that were inferior, lower rungs on the evolutionary ladder. Here is Samuel Dawids.
And that was used as a form of denigration to suggest that we are subhuman and that Europeans come from a more higher form of human beings than us, and we remained in the archaic stage.
It's this idea of human evolution Rudolf Pöch's works fits within. When he measures people in the Kalahari, he doesn't believe he's looking at people like himself. The Bushmen are prehistoric, primitive, and about to die out. His work is to catalogue them, just like Linneaus had recorded the characteristics of plants in northern Sweden.
They would measure your cranium and say that, okay, right, you can only think up to so far because your cranium is this size and this shape and stuff like that, you know?
The thing that Pöch and many of his scientific colleagues ignore is that there is nothing natural about the condition their subjects live under. The people whose bones Rudolf Pöch collects haven't been living peacefully in the Kalahari since the beginning of time. They used to live all over southern Africa. The San, for example, moved around following the seasonal changes and the migration of the animals they depended on for survival. But then Europeans settled on the southern tip of the continent. With them came the privatization of land, fences, guns, government, and an ever-expanding colonial society. The San fought, but it was a losing battle, and they were pushed further and further to drier and harsher lands, like the Kalahari. So the San mastered surviving the harsh environment. But in the end it didn't matter. Settlers came even there and erected fences, declared borders, and drilled boreholes that gave them access to water where they had until then been unable to survive. And it's near these boreholes that Rudolf Pöch sets up camp in the Kalahari. Here is Anette Hoffmann.
So there was only water left in boreholes. So he pitched his tent there, and he just had to wait for people to come because they had to, because there was no surface water anymore.
There's a drought, and eventually the people he intends to measure, record, and photograph must drink.
He could use the water holes as a place to meet people, whether they wanted to meet him or not. They had to ask permission, or they had to have permission of some kind to actually get water there. So he could basically use that kind of power.
And of course, if nothing else works, Pöch has another kind of very concrete power.
He was also armed. I mean, Pöch was an armed white man in an area that was anyway dangerous for the people who were living there who weren't white.
At this point, Pöch has started collecting bones, but so far appears to have spent more time and energy on recording voices and measuring people. This is the fieldwork of race science, the human equivalent of observing moss and flowers. In practice, Pöch uses calipers and measuring tapes to meticulously measure the skull and limbs of people. It can take up to 6 hours to measure a single person. What we might call consent does not even begin to feature into the equation.
There is a hierarchy in his mind of, the position of people socially. So he clearly thinks that he basically is in the position to force people to do whatever he wants them to do. And he does that.
Because Pöch is on top, his actions are justified. And those below are not consulted, just like you don't ask whether a horse feels like carrying you. To Pöch, this is all the natural order of the world. Rudolf Pöch has traveled through German Southwest Africa and what today's Botswana. But he spends the last leg of his journey in the southern Kalahari, in today's South Africa. And it's during this time his collection of human remains really begins to grow. He needs to keep track of it all, and writes in his diary. C31 child, 1 package, he writes. C32 big child, 1 package. And then there's this entry. S33 child was wrapped in much cloth. This is the only time Pöch notes a child wrapped in cloth. We can only speculate as to why this child is wrapped, but it does seem significant. The child is buried during a time of extreme scarcity. Cloth is expensive, hard to come by. So when a mother wraps her dead child in cloth before putting them into the ground, it's a great sacrifice. An act of love, I imagine. An act that's reversed soon after, when Pöch unburies the child, noting in his diary that it isn't fully decayed yet. I find it difficult to think about the grieving mother. Did she know Pöch took the remains of her dead child? Pöch himself doesn't express any second thoughts about taking the remains of this or any other child, or adult for that matter. But he isn't without emotion. Here is Professor Walter Sauer.
In the diaries, there are on some days, maybe he was drunk, or it was Christmas time and he was getting emotional. But then he notes down thoughts you would not believe. Like, I know I am cheating everyone. Now, why was he cheating? I cannot understand. But he had not the best feeling of himself, seemingly. But that is maybe in every 2-3 months he notes down such an idea.
After all these years, Pöch's self-doubts are right there on the page. They help us see him as a more complex human being, a man who also suffered. But in the same diary, not a single word is written about the mother who wrapped her child in expensive cloth. Complexity is reserved for the man who keeps the record. For researchers like Sophie Chasipin, who has spent months and months reading in his diary, this becomes a paradox. How much empathy do you reserve for a man who expressed so little for the people whose bones he took?
Someone once advised me that, you have to really take the person seriously that you're investigating. You can't just bash them in order to do a proper critique. I would still not be willing to allow for that level of empathy with that man.
When you spend hours and hours reading someone's diary, you're bound to begin to understand them. For most of us, empathy comes naturally. But according to researcher Sophie Chasipin, empathy has also been used as a tool to whitewash the legacy of Rudolf Pöch.
I first heard about these kind of self-doubts or read about these kind of self-doubts in literature that very much kind of try to rehabilitate him. So then these doubts are used to make him appear more human, are used to, for us to be able to identify more with him, etc.
But even so, when you spend so much time with someone's thoughts, something is going to seep through the cracks.
There are quite a few notes in the diary also in which he actually kind of punishes himself for being so weak.
In Sophie's case, Pöch's self-doubt hasn't made her sympathize more with him or his project. But in analyzing his darker moments, she has come to better understand his worldview, the ideals he sometimes struggles to live up to.
And to me, this is actually the more significant aspect of it, because I think, as I said before, he's someone who's very much caught, or who very much identifies with racial eugenic ideas. So he, of course, would have that expectation towards himself to kind of represent, the Herrenrasse, to represent the superior race. So when he sees himself failing at that, then he doubts himself.
Pöch hates the weakness he finds in himself because it contradicts his entire worldview. As a European man of his time, he's superior and he shouldn't succumb to feelings of weakness. And yet he does. A worldview that's directly informed by his own scientific discipline.
The early researchers were, and we're talking of the 1920s, 1930s, inherited 19th century anthropology. And 19th century anthropology was race transfixed.
Here's Professor Alan Morris again, explaining how Pöch and his contemporaries understood race.
And what they felt was that race was the key to understanding humanity. Amongst the things that they visualized was the idea that race and behavior, today we would talk about ethnicity and biology, that they were linked together. So that if you could describe the biology of a population, you by definition described its behavior and its knowledge and its psychology and its activity. Everything became race.
It's difficult to overestimate the effects of this worldview on the indigenous people of the Kalahari. Because the logical conclusion is that the racial hierarchies that already exist on the ground are meant to be. That Pöch is on top and the Bushmen marginalized in the extreme is a consequence of a natural order. It's, of course, completely and utterly wrong. As modern science begins to realize, trying to isolate pure types is like chasing the wind. If you want to understand the world, looking for purity is pointless. What you need to understand is variation.
We went from looking at kind of the purity to the variation. All of a sudden, the Linnean system doesn't work so well. So what was happening was, nowadays, the Linnean system, we still use it for convenience. We still talk about Homo sapiens. But we're no longer rigid about the way we see the species and the variety. So we've changed the way we see it, but we're still using the Linnean system because it's so wonderfully convenient to use.
From a modern scientific point of view, what Pöch was doing and believing was wrong. A kind of disastrous detour in science. But back then, when he's digging up graves and measuring skulls in the Kalahari, race science is at its peak. And its effects reverberates far beyond the scientific world.
Well, their purpose was to turn the idea of race into science.
This is historian Ciraj Rassool. He spent decades researching the work of Pöch and his contemporaries. And to him, segregation and later apartheid is directly linked with the scientific project of people like Pöch.
And for them, the so-called Bushman was an example of a remarkably still living, ancient ancestor of human beings.
Ciraj Rassool argues that these scientific ideas have a direct influence on how racial segregation and later apartheid comes to define modern South Africa.
Demarcating the society into races and to having a concept of what the limits were of the natural abilities of those races, what the differences were in their intelligence, what the differences were in all of their capacities, as those policies were being instituted and as the so-called races were being segregated from each other.
When the rigid racial hierarchies of the 20th centuries are built, the foundation is made up of the bones of the Bushmen, and they are placed at the very bottom.
Feels to me as like a double kind of indignity that happens. What do you think about that? Is that a correct reading in your opinion?
That's an absolutely correct reading, and that is also part of the reason why this collecting legacy has got to be decommissioned urgently. And that is what restitution does. It brings an end to this chapter of racism that is part of the perpetuation of a colonial order in the world.
To undo the legacy of Dr. Pöch and his colleagues is Ciraj Rassool's mission. He's been working at it for decades. A mission he began when he stumbled upon the bones collected by Rudolf Pöch and others, which had been sitting in museum collections for most of the 20th century.
It became very clear to us that we were dealing with a situation where the collections consisted of the dead, the racialized dead, of people who had died very shortly before their bodies were disinterred, or unburied is the term that we use now.
Apartheid was over, but all of its institutions still needed to be transformed to a new democratic South Africa. And Ciraj Rassool began this work with his colleague, the now deceased historian Martin Legasek. And as they began putting the pieces together, they realized the scale and the brutality of the legacy of Pöch and his contemporaries.
What made the bodies of Klaas and Troy Pienaar unusual in that collecting history is that when their bodies were unburied, they were thought to be in an excellent condition. And so Menjarto, who was the assistant to Rudolf Pöch, chose not to boil those corpses down to bone on the spot, according to Rudolf Pöch's instructions. Instead, he broke the legs at the knees and then stuffed them into a single barrel, which he filled with salt. And that barrel was put onto an ox wagon.
In the next episode, you'll hear the full story of Klaas and Troy Pienaar, Pöch's assistant Mr. Menarto, and the final frenzy of bone and body collection in the Kalahari. The Unburied Podcast is a production by ARC in partnership with Iziko Museums of South Africa. The series is produced, written and sound designed by myself and Neil Liddell, with support from Dane Dutz, Naima Malaika, Brian Minis, Neil Rush, and most of all, the archaeology unit at the Iziko Museum in Cape Town. If you want to help us keep doing this work, there are several ways to do it. You can become an archangel and support us directly. You can also just post this podcast on social media or give us a review wherever you listen. And of course, you can also help us simply by sharing it with the people you like. Thanks for listening.